Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Florence and the Machine, High as Hope. So I'm a little bit stunned that I haven't heard more buzz around this album. See, I remember back in 2015 when Florence and the Machine unleashed How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful with their lead-off single, What Kind of Man? Arguably one of the band's best ever songs and one of my favorite tracks of that year. And yet I was kind of lukewarm to the album itself. Not that it was bad, but unlike that song, more of the album couldn't sustain the oversold bombast from the production or Florence Welch's heavily multi-track delivery, which was a damn shame because the writing had never been better. And yes, I know I'm still very much in the minority when it comes to opinions on that album. I did not like it as much as so many people did, but returning to it even now, I was continuously struck by how damn uneven it felt, especially in the production. And thus, I was interested to hear how much High as Hope was pivoting out of that territory, instead reportedly going for a brand of minimalism that seemed almost antithetical to Florence and the Machine's approach across their entire career. And that's before you know how they had switched producers to Emil Haney, who primarily got his start in hip-hop before racking up credits across the mainstream for the past decade, from Kid Cudi to Eminem, from Kanye West to Lana Del Rey. So yeah, while critics have been kinda mixed to receptive about the album, I wasn't sure whatsoever what we could be getting with it, especially as it's Florence and the Machine's shortest album to date, and that could mean anything. So alright, how is High as Hope? So okay, here's the funny thing. You could definitely argue this is a more stripped back and borderline restrained album from Florence and the Machine, for as much restraint as even possible for a group like this one. And you know, for a nice change of pace, the production actually takes real steps to double down on the core melodies and deliver a more cohesive project overall. Hell, in comparison to the slapdash messiness in the production that put me off so much of their 2015 album, while not compromising or overselling Florence Welch's huge presence, this is probably the first album from Florence and the Machine that's got the refined focus to really click a lot more deeply with me. And yet, alright, look, I'll definitely argue it's a really good, likely even great album, but it did get really hard to avoid a comparison to a project that took a very similar sound to even greater heights just a month ago, but you know what, we'll get to that pretty soon. But first, the most notable improvement, the production. Because on the surface, in composition, in arrangements, Florence and the Machine, they're relying on a lot of the same template they worked on How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful. The blocky percussion and drums that shakes the mix, the jagged staccato piano chords, the accent notes of horns and harp, and the occasional bit of guitar to drive off the richer tapestry of strings, all building in swells of multi-tracking and choirs to crank all that bombast up to 11. And yet what somebody in the production booth finally realized is that overselling every single element in the mix, especially the vocal multi-tracking, it leads to songs that lack dynamics or a credible crescendo, and thus not only are the backing vocals more precisely arranged this time around to give the song some real breathing room, but we get more delicate and restrained cuts interspersed between the track lists that are confident enough to let Florence Welch's tremendous delivery carry the mix without any need for augmentation. And while I'm most inclined to give Emil Haney a lot of credit for this choice, well, Florence Welch co-produced the majority of this album, and the choice to opt for subtler modulation, it places a much heavier onus on her delivery, and yeah, she really does. I've always said that she's got a ton of presence and power, but I've always placed her in the same category and camp as artists who rely a lot more on that than the subtler, more cutting emotional delivery, and boy, when given the opportunity here, she proved me wrong in spades. Strip away the garish textures and show an artist confident enough in her performance to end the album with an absolutely stunning ballad with no histrionics whatsoever, no even need for them. That shows a lot of artistic growth and maturity on her part, and I'll give her all the credit in the world for that. And that sense of modulation means that the moments that do go for that climax, they hit a little bit harder for me. Hunger is the most immediate standout as the lead-off single. Even if I do think What Kind of Man is still a high watermark in terms of just raw, furious power, it was also lightning in a bottle of that song actually working, while Hunger is more naturally affirmative, and it earns its swell just as effectively against the driving piano and the sharper bass line. Hell, that deeper focus on groove overall and a more balanced mix also brings out a great contrast against the tinkling pianos around Sky Full of Song, or the thrumming swells of strings on Patricia, or even the achingly slow, sandy swell of June, or the murky keys of Big God. And that's before we get the more restrained, minimalistic cuts like No Choir, or Grace, or the stunning multi-tracking and strings of the end End of Love. Now, I won't always say the production entirely sticks the landing. The smoother, rounded tones of South London Forever and the drums and the sharper strings leave me feeling that there should be a greater swell that just does not come through effectively, especially with the touches of saxophone that don't really pay off. And 100 Years has a similar sense of gentle distance from the main vocal line, with the touches of tremolo picking midway to the back of the mix that leave me thinking the climax should hit with more surging power, or, hit at all. Hell, it almost seems like the outside of the overweight drum pickups and the sharper guitar, they were just kind of hedging their bets a little bit too much to let the song really take off. Hell, they got Kamasi Washington on the saxophone there, and the fact that this song doesn't really hit that swell, that might be a crime with him on board. But now we have to get to the meat of the things, the lyrics and the themes. And here's the thing. One thing that I think I'd kind of overlooked in the backlash to my review of How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful was how the writing really was what saved that album from its production issues. And on High as Hope, Florence Welch, she really continues in a lot of that tradition. Now, what I've always liked about a lot of her songwriting is that she's got no qualms going for broke and using words that really match her delivery. And she's smart enough to keep her framing back just far enough to encapsulate that reckless danger of it all. And thus, when the fundamental themes of this album and High as Hope are yearning for some deeper form of fulfillment in order to satisfy that yawning hole deep within herself that she's plugged in with alcohol and drugs and wild love in the past, and it hasn't worked, and since she's something of a classicist, she'll evoke religious ecstasy to characterize the feeling of a crush not returning her text on Big God. And while that could come across as oversold or melodramatic on previous albums, with a more restrained and human aesthetic on this album, hell, a song like Sky Full of Song is all about that grounding presence bringing her back down to earth. It actually kind of bridges that gap in the framing to make those broader metaphors feel kind of remarkably resonant, and that especially comes through on the two songs named for women that Florence Welch clearly adores. Her little sister Grace, who's always seemed more mature and grounded in her own way, and Patti Smith on Patricia, where she questions if in all the insanity of the larger world that Patti Smith had ever had that same yearning and how she'd ever managed to plug it up. And I really do love how the album concludes with The End of Love and No Choir, where she learns not to put aside passion, but not to use it to plug a hole inside, and thus learn to cherish those little moments in between the extremes of emotion that can fill that void. They'll likely wind up being forgotten, but it's worth it all the same. And you know what? If I were to criticize any part of that writing, as much as I might like that central theme, well, hell, it's not even really a criticism given the more personal framing and stakes here. They kind of work, but I was hard-pressed to ignore the immediate similarities to Nico Case's Hell On, which also took similar introspective themes. I mean, they're similar performers, and I do think that Nico Case's more layered poetry is just a cut above in the blunter language that Florence Welch is using here. But at the same time, that bluntness does serve a purpose, and it's most definitely a lot more accessible, and for the first time I get the impression that Florence and the Machine can really play in that same ballpark as Nico Case, with a much stronger sense of refinement across the board, from the production to the thematic cohesion to even Florence's delivery. This is a record that only got better with every single listen I gave it, and well, I might be the only one who's actually saying it. I might think this might be their best to date. And for me, High as Hope is getting a light 8 out of 10 and absolutely a recommendation. Perhaps not the immediate wallop of How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful, or even their previous two albums, but a record that reflects the maturity and poise to at last go forward in this vein. And speaking as somebody who was not really a fan before now, she won me over. You gotta hear this. Really great stuff. Definitely check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I'm actually a little bit mystified how this record's not getting more acclaim. I guess where people aren't really sinking into it the same way I am, or I've seen a lot of reviews calling it boring, but really, give it time with the modulation, the greater sense of dynamics, the lyrics, the thematic cohesion. You'll want to give this record time. You'll want to get the record. Buy the record, links down below. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious where more people fall on this. Again, I think the opinions have been kind of mixed, but again, I really like this. This is definitely worth your time. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, a link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week the contributors get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there. If you want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.